McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and welcome back to the McCuistion program. I'm here with my co-host, Jim Falk, and we're going to talk about an issue that is on the top of your mind. It's called inflation. Now, we know that you know what inflation is, or do you? And do you really know what it is? And do you know what causes it? And do you know what the Fed is doing and how they're trying to fix whatever the problem is, if there is a problem? Those kind of questions we're going to ask, and then we're going to try to figure out what to do about it and how you should run your life based upon the inflation environment that we apparently find ourselves in. Jim, why don't you introduce our guests?
I will. And Dennis, I'm so glad we're looking at this timely topic because all of us are certainly feeling it, whether you go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk or looking for a pre-owned car. I read just a few days ago that the price of pre-owned cars has gone up over 40%. And really pleased that we have two, shall I say, formidable experts to bring their different perspectives on this timely and important subject. So let me introduce Brian Wesbury. He's the chief economist at First Trust Advisors, and in 2012 he was named a fellow at the George W. Bush Presidential Center. He's had experience on Capitol Hill, where he was the chief economist for the Joint Economic Committee, and the Wall Street Journal once named him the nation's #1 economic forecaster. Joining Brian is Dr. Jim Dolmas, where Jim is with the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, where he's the economic policy advisor as well as senior economist. He received his doctorate at the University of Rochester, of course, in economics, and he's particularly known for developing an alternative tool to measure core inflation. I'm going to let him explain to you what the Dallas Trim PCE rate is, but I think you'll find it very interesting and a different way to understand what we're seeing now with inflation. Let me remind all of us, though, that Dr. Dolmas is presenting his own views, and they may or may not reflect those of the Dallas Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So with that caveat, gentlemen, welcome, and let's get started. Jim, I think all of us have, as Dennis said, an appreciation and an understanding of inflation. And what we're seeing now may be different, but basically, what is inflation and what contributes to it?
I would describe inflation as it's a rise in the general level of prices that's sustained over time. So there's both a breadth and a time dimension to it. It's not one item that you buy going up in price, say coffee or what have you, although that would affect your cost of living. So it has to be broad and it has to be somewhat sustained. That's a kind of practical answer. I know there are probably more philosophical answers out there, but I prefer the more practical minded one. That it's a sustained increase in prices in general. Now, that sweeps a lot under the rug. What does prices in general mean? That gets us into issues of how we measure these things and so on.
Well, let's go ahead now and jump into what you developed, this alternative way to measure inflation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the Dallas Fed, the trim mean is really it was sort of a response to something maybe that you're more familiar with, that is excluding food and energy as a measure of core inflation, so-called core inflation. And there are a number of measures out there that have that flavor, which there's some sense to eliminating sort of volatile items to get from the index to get a better sense of the underlying trends in inflation, because all items inflation, so an index that includes everything, and they tend to be very noisy. So extracting the signal from those can be very difficult. And very
so let me ask you this: is it always energy and food that you remove, or could it be another?
No, our approach was basically not to exclude just food and energy and only food and energy. And for the simple reasons that there are parts of food and energy that aren't especially volatile. And there are all sorts of other items in the basket of things we consume that are volatile. So the approach is really to take out the most extreme price movements up or down each month and really focus on what's going on with sort of the fat middle of the distribution of changes in prices from month to month to get a sense of where the underlying trend in inflation is at.
Your index is typically less than the consumer price index, which is what people normally think about. Yours is typically maybe a half a point less. But the question today is that you guys have been shooting for a 2% inflation rate. We'll talk about why that is in just a minute. But it's obviously even your index is over that right now. So what do you see going forward about what you're projecting with your, which is less than the CPI, but still higher than the 2%?
Yes, well, I guess to take one thing first is that this difference with the CPI, I mean, it points to this, there's different measures of inflation are like different tools that have different purposes. So you wouldn't want to use our measure to judge what's happening to somebody's cost of living. The CPI is very good for that. Our tools are more interpretive and more forward-looking. What do we expect going forward with our measure? Well, conveniently, we just put out a blog post on our Dallas Fed Economics blog, myself and a number of colleagues, where we see our measure, which is right now running a bit less than 2%, accelerating to something on the order of 2.4%, which for that measure would be a pretty substantial pickup, probably the highest level it's been going back a number of years. That's what we expect for 2022 as a whole. And our interpretation of that is that this surge we're seeing in all items inflation indices, that some portion of that is going to be transitory, is likely to be transitory, but there is kind of a hefty portion that is going to persist. So there is going to be some persistence in inflation going into next year and the year after. So, I mean, that's in terms of our forecast for what our measure is going to do. And by the nature of the way we constructed it, it's also a very good forecast of what the all items PCE inflation rate, the one that the Fed actually targets, what that's going to be doing. So that would be our outlook, that there is going to be some persistence.
All right, great. I appreciate that. Now, Brian, I saw you yesterday on a great webinar for the Institute for Policy Innovation here in Dallas, and you were talking about the biggest mistake ever made in the world, which is all the government debt. But you spent a lot of time talking about inflation. Jim Dolmas mentioned transitory. How do you see inflation right now, and what's your, I mean, you're the forecaster, what's your prognostication?
Yeah, well, I agree with Jim Dolmas that some of the inflation that we're seeing right now is transitory. I mean, used car prices, one of the reasons they're up so much, and Jim Falk talked about that, is because we have a shortage of computer chips. And a lot of this goes back to shutting down the economy because of the pandemic. Also, we are paying people to not work. So we have a lot of demand and a constrained supply. And so from your day one in Economics 101, you learn demand and supply. So part of that is inflation right now. And that will tend to drift away. But I do also believe with Jim Dolmas that some of this is persistent. And I would argue it's probably more than even he thinks. It's definitely more than, and I'm not trying to pick a fight, but I hear Chairman Powell say it's basically all transitory, and I do not agree. The money supply has exploded. The M2 measure of money, that's what Milton Friedman told me to watch, is up 32% since February of 2020. So that's a 1/3 increase in the amount of money in the economy. I agree with Jim Dolmas's practical description, a general rise in prices. But when I describe inflation to people, my belief is that it is a decline in the purchasing power of money. And one of the ways that that happens is that you print more money. If you have a bumper crop of corn, the price of corn comes down. If you have a bumper crop of dollars, the value of the dollar comes down. And I think that's one of the key reasons we have big inflation numbers today.
Jim, I'd like you to respond to what Brian said, but before you do that, tell us about how the pandemic has really changed inflation, affected it in certain industries, like what we're seeing with transportation, tourism, obviously appliances, finding repairmen.
You know, in the midst of this downturn like we never saw before, and a recovery of the speed we've never seen before, we had this really dramatic shift in the composition of people's spending, basically plowing their spending into physical stuff, into goods. They couldn't go on vacations, couldn't go out to restaurants, sitting at home. So in a typical downturn, we would see goods consumption, particularly durable goods, plummet, and services just chug along. We saw the exact opposite of that this time, which you can imagine. So then throw in a few supply outages here and there, related to COVID, and you have this gigantic boom in demand for goods, some supply outages, and you get things like this chip shortage, shortages of lumber, shortages of other materials that are leading to some of these price spikes that, as Brian said, and I think, you know, my view too, is much of those are going to be transitory. But in terms of, and this comes back a little bit to a point I made earlier about our view that some of this is going to persist. I mean, historically, when we see these big spikes, whether they're isolated in energy goods or food, they reflect some imbalances in supply and demand, where if those imbalances persist, they do percolate into a broader range of goods and services. The pickups may be more modest, but they're more broad-based. And that's sort of that's the mechanism that we sort of have in mind when we're envisioning this persistence into next year, some of the inflation that we're seeing this year.
Okay, Jim, let me, you guys have done your definitions of inflation, which I agree with, but I usually say inflation is an increase in the price generally of goods caused by an increase in the supply of money. And you talked about M2 going up by 32%. The Fed has chosen several years ago now to try to have 2% inflation. I'd like for you to tell us why that is, number one. And secondly, as you know very well, 2% inflation will drop the purchasing power of the dollar by 50% in 36 years. Why would the Fed want any inflation?
That's a good question. So I mean, if you go back, think back to Alan Greenspan, defined price stability when he was chairman, right? It was price stability is a situation where nobody thinks about inflation anymore, where it doesn't factor into people's decisions, business plans. And he also conjectured, I think at the same time, that it was probably something positive in terms of the measures we have, because the measures we have are admittedly somewhat flawed. There are things they don't pick up well, like the introduction of new and better varieties of goods. So they could be biased upward. So if we targeted, say, a 0% increase in PCE inflation, that might correspond in actuality and what's truly going on to a kind of deflationary scenario. So that was sort of one argument for targeting something positive. And in the intervening years between when Chairman Greenspan made those remarks to today, a lot of central banks around the world have adopted explicit numerical targets, and most of them are around 2%. There are other reasons that have to do with a little more academic, that have to do with kind of greasing the wheels of the labor market, that have to do with giving central banks policy space the ability to cut rates if they need to support the economy.
All right, Jim, I think that's a great explanation. I appreciate that. Now, Brian, I think Brian, you and I might agree that typically, because of efficiencies and productivity and everything else, that left alone, the general price level would in fact decrease, and that would be a good thing as opposed to trying to keep inflation. Am I right about that, or how do you look at what Jim Dolmas said?
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of things to unpack here, so to speak, but that's exactly right. If I sort of have this bias. We want our pay to go up over time, and I think part of that is because the Federal Reserve for over 100 years now has been printing money and creating inflation. But if we were on a gold standard, let's say, we wouldn't increase the amount of money in the economy. Your pay might stay level over time, but the price of the things you buy keeps going down. So your living standards go up, even though your salary isn't more next year than it was this year. And if you talk about Austrian economists, I would highly recommend people that are really interested in economics, Ludwig von Mises, read Milton Friedman too, but Friedrich Hayek, Böhm-Bawerk, these are unbelievable thinkers, and they talk about the role of money in the economy. And one of the interesting things, just to, I'm not trying to change the subject from inflation, but when we go back, normally the Federal Reserve in an emergency will increase the amount of money, but it's normally to keep the financial system from having problems. And this past 15, 16 months, I've seen the Fed do something that I've never seen it do before, and that is print money, and a massive amount of money, and buy a lot of treasury bonds with no financial crisis going on. The stock market is at an all-time record high. Banks have more capital and less problem loans than they've almost ever had in history, and yet the Federal Reserve is printing all of this money. And so if I go back to the Austrians and Milton Friedman, they would say printing all this money has to create inflation. So anyway, I agree with you. Normally prices would fall. By the way, if you kind of think about that, if you're going to invent a new technology, and we can think of all kinds of things, Microsoft, Apple, all these these things that we buy, normally their price might decline, let's say 10% in a year. But if we print more money, even though your Apple iPhone got better and technically it dropped by 10%, but because we printed money, it's now only down 5%. And that to me is inflation. It should have gone down by 10, but it only went down by 5. So arguing that going down by 5 is better, to me, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, Jim, let me ask you, because of course, one of the goals of the Fed is to maintain an acceptable employment rate or unemployment rate. How does that tie into the 2% goal that the Fed tries to maintain?
Well, the Fed, as you said, we have these two goals of maximum employment and price stability, and the pursuit of those is we conduct through easing or tightening financial conditions. What happens with resource utilization, with the unemployment rate, ultimately may redound to shifts in inflation. As the economy heats up, inflation picks up. As the economy slackens, as resource utilization slackens, inflation comes down. But many times those goals are many times those goals are aligned: maximum employment and stable prices. Sometimes they're a bit out of line, and then the Fed takes an approach that looks at those two goals and the disparity between those, where those things are at and where our targets are.
Well, we have just a few minutes left. So summarize for us, Jim, the tools that the Fed has at its disposal now to adjust inflation.
Well, as I said, it's not that the Fed has a sort of lever that controls inflation. It's a somewhat indirect process. The Fed has tools that affect financial conditions, that affect interest rates. They have an interest rate they control directly. In the last two recessions and recoveries, they've engaged in asset purchases that have affected longer run interest rates. But those changes in financial conditions translate into changes in tightness or slackness in resource utilization in the economy. Loosened financial conditions is sort of like stepping on the accelerator. The economy grows a bit faster. It runs up against its productive capacity a little bit more, which leads to higher inflation. Tighten financial conditions a bit, you get the opposite, slowing activity down a bit, reducing inflation. Of course, I mean, the danger is I'm making it sound very mechanical and very precise, like driving a car. You step on the gas, but as Milton Friedman said, you know, there are these long and variable lags in policy. So it's like driving a car where there's a random delay between stepping on the gas and gas flowing to the engine, and then another random delay between gas flowing to the engine and it getting to the drivetrain. And then on top of it, your window's dirty.
And especially when you have the disconnect between the fiscal and monetary policy.
Yeah. Exactly. So there's some, it's not as precise as driving a car, but the mechanism is.
Well, you're certainly right about the lags, and Milton Friedman talked about. Now, two or three things, Brian, that you talked about yesterday. First, would you drive a quick stake in MMT and tell everybody what that is?
Sure. Yeah, modern monetary theory, and I'm not saying that the Fed believes in this. I certainly hope they don't. But modern monetary theory is this sort of new idea out there that if we're the world's reserve currency, the U.S., then we can issue as much debt as we want, we can print as much money as we want, and we will not see a reduction in our standards of living. We won't get inflation as a result of that. And I just find this, as Mervyn King, who was a member of the Bank of England, he said there's nothing modern about it. It's not monetary and it's not a theory. All right. So, but nonetheless, they have this exciting name, modern monetary theory. And apparently you can get something for nothing. And I just totally agree with that, disagree with that. Let me just address one thing that Jim Dolmas said, or put it in my words. One of the problems that I see today is that because of the pandemic, not only did we shut down the economy, that's why unemployment went up. It wasn't because the Federal Reserve was too tight, wasn't printing enough money. It's because we shut down the economy. The second thing is today, unemployment is higher than it would be if we weren't paying people. So what we have is this fascinating period where the Federal Reserve is buying treasury bonds and keeping interest rates low, and giving that money, in a sense, to the Treasury Department, who are then paying people not to work. So this idea that there's a link between unemployment and inflation, that link is gone. It's because the government is now artificially keeping unemployment high, and then the Fed is trying to bring it back down by printing money. And I just find those two at massive cross purposes, and I think we will pay a price for that policy.
Well, Brian, let me ask you one other thing about that you said yesterday. You talked about something that Jay Powell said. If we believe that inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply, and has been, and Milton Friedman believed it, and Mises and Hayek also. Right. He said something that you took issue with. What was it that Jay Powell said?
Yeah, I believe this. It was in the Senate, I believe, in his testimony in front of the Senate. And I think it was to Senator Kennedy. But he said, you know, and Senator Kennedy said, wait a minute, we have this big increase in the money supply. And Jerome Powell, and I'm going to paraphrase, he goes, yeah, when we were kids in school, we learned that money and inflation were linked. And he goes, but we have to unlearn that. And the way I took it is we have to unlearn Milton Friedman. And I just find that almost flabbergasting. It's Milton Friedman. He won the Nobel Prize for a reason. He figured out the Great Depression. He was absolutely right. Every piece of research I've ever done, and that's why I think that statement was just. I think it was wrong. But let me just fit one little thing in here. There are a lot of forecasters like me and people that debate economics, and they'll say, hey, the Federal Reserve did quantitative easing back in 08 and 09, and we didn't get inflation. And my answer to that is, yeah, you're right, because we hammered banks with regulation. And maybe I shouldn't say hammered. We regulated banks so that even though the Fed's balance sheet was growing, the M2 measure of money didn't grow faster than about 6% for the whole decade. Now we're forcing banks to lend through PPP loans and depositing all this money directly, and that's why M2 is exploding. So it's different than the first round of QE.
Exactly.
Brian, I want to give you 15 seconds to answer this before Dennis closes our program. Has Wall Street built inflation into the market?
Yeah, no, it has not. I don't think the stock market is overvalued, although it's pretty fully valued. But interest rates should be a lot higher. It reminds me of, in a way, looking back at the 70s. If you would have bought a 10-year bond in 1972, 73, you would not have earned the inflation rate.
And we're out of time, unfortunately. Jim Dolmas, thank you very much. Jim Falk, of course, and Brian, thank you all so much. At some point, Richard Ebeling said, as well as Hayek, a new recession or depression will emerge, and there'll be a lot of hand-wringing. It'll be blamed on capitalism, but what it really will be caused by is poor government policy. That's what he had to say. I hope that's not the case. And Jim, I appreciate all the things you guys are doing with the Fed to try to work these levers as best you can. So thank you very much for all of you, and thank you for joining us, where we're giving you a different perspective here, things that matter with people who really care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.